clearly didn't heed my warning about being brief. Let me say how pleased I am to be here and how pleased I was to meet several people from Georgia Pacific who are in the audience this afternoon. Georgia Pacific, of course, was bought not that long ago by Charles Koch and his brother David. I've known Koch Industries in Wichita. I've known Charles since he came to England in 1976 to join in the celebration of the bicentenary of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And I've worked closely with him, very closely at times. In fact, for 2 years was president of the Charles Koch Foundation. And so I'm very pleased to meet some of his new colleagues and to tell you that he's a very great man, a man of great principle, a man of great learning and great understanding. It's been a great privilege to me to have known him for 36 years now, I guess. I've got about 35 minutes here, I guess, 35 to 40 minutes. I'm going to quickly walk you through some key points about Margaret, and then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. First, her ascent. She was born in the mid-1920s in a small market town of Grantham in Lincolnshire, which is on the eastern side of the United Kingdom. Self-employment dominates her family tree on both sides, as far back as we can go. She was the second daughter of a man called Alf Roberts, so she grew up as Margaret Roberts, and he ran the local grocer shop, where she often worked. Alf was a pillar of the local community. He held every conceivable civic post, from councilman to alderman to mayor, and during World War II was even the air raid precaution warden. He left school at age 12, but was known as the most learned man in town. And every week he would take Margaret to the local library, and they would come back with piles of books. There was no bath or running hot water in the house, there was no radio, no TV, but there were lots of books everywhere. An adult conversation was the order of the day at every meal. The movie house opened her eyes to the outside world, and one of her favourite early movies was Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which she loved. With the war, World War II, the US Air Force came to Lincolnshire for two reasons. Firstly, it was very flat, and secondly, it was on the east side of England, as I said, and so it was very much closer to the enemy territory, and the bombers could go much deeper into enemy territory from those bases. But this led to a problem, because some servicemen would have Sundays off, and back then, Sundays, well, everything was closed, even the parks were closed. They would put a chain around the gates, and a big padlock on it. And Alf was struggling. Should he allow the movie house to open, or should he let the parks stay open on Sundays so these men on rotation could have something to do? And in the end, he decided to let the movie house open on the grounds that having boisterous young Americans in the movie house was less disruptive than having them running around the park, hurtling footballs everywhere. Walking to school, Margaret would go by the dole queues of the 30s, and in the early 40s, bomb damage, because although Grantham was a small market town, it had a bomb-making factory that the Germans would regularly try and take out. She skipped a year at grade school, and she aimed for chemistry at Oxford. This was a huge reach. You know, back then in the early 1940s, for a girl with that kind of background from a small provincial town to study chemistry at Oxford or Cambridge, or in her case Oxford, was an enormous reach. She needed Latin. Why you needed Latin to read chemistry, I have no idea. And her school didn't even have a Latin teacher. So Alf dipped into his savings and hired the Latin teacher from the boys' school. Of course, the boys had a Latin teacher. In 6 months of private tuition, she accomplished 7 years of Latin. And she got in. She got into Oxford at age 17 to study chemistry. She volunteered 2 nights a week at the local United States Air Force Base, bussing tables. The Union, the famous debating society, was then closed to women. They could enter and sit up with the gods up at the top, but they couldn't participate on the floor. And Margaret was going to have nothing to do with that. I mean, she wasn't going to sit there watching the men perform. So she threw herself into the Oxford University Conservative Association, and she became its second ever lady president. The lady who beat her had a lot of family connections. So Margaret was really the first one to get that job on merit. After graduating, she got a job in industry as a chemist. She was adopted for the safe Labour seat of Dartford in Kent, just outside of London, and fought the 50 and 51 elections there. And instead, she met a local businessman, Dennis Thatcher, married Dennis, became Margaret Thatcher, bore the twins, Mark and Carol, and it was while she was sitting in bed in hospital recovering from giving birth to the twins that she signed up the paperwork to enrol her as a trainee barrister, to switch from chemistry to the law. Barrister being the kind of lawyer who stands up and argues in court, not the kind of guy who sits in an office and does your will or your house deed or whatever. So she decided as the late 50s rolled around, having sat out the 55 election, that the 59 election she really deserved, having fought twice in the early 50s, a safe seat. And she applied, and time again she came second. And it was the women who opposed them. The women on the Conservative selection committees. They wanted a nice young man with a pretty wife who stayed at home looking after their 2.5 children, and hopefully he had a good job in industry and a chest full of medals from the war and so on and so forth. They didn't want this pushy chemist turned lawyer who had a rich husband, which allowed her to hire all kinds of nannies and au pairs and pursue a full-time career. She ended up actually at the tax bar as a tax barrister. But finally, Finchley adopted her. Finchley is a district of North London, and by a very, very, very slim margin. And she served Finchley from 59 through to 1992 when she went to the House of Lords. And I think from then on, being a woman helped her advance, because there were so few women in politics, there were very few Conservative female MPs, and she was, of course, an immensely talented person. And from then on, when, for example, Edward Heath won the 70 election, he turned to his good friend Geoffrey Rippon and said, "Well, Geoffrey, I suppose Margaret's got to be our statutory woman in the cabinet." And then, having gotten her place in the cabinet, he sat her so far down the end that she virtually had to lean halfway across the table in order to attract his eye. Second, what was the state of the UK when she won? Well, the winter of 1979 was called the Winter of Discontent, as in Shakespeare's first line in Richard III, "Now is the winter of our discontent." We'd had double-digit inflation for 6 years, averaging 16%, and at one point getting up to 30%. Gas supplies had been disrupted, there were pickets all over the place, 1 million people were laid off. Ambulances had stopped responding to 911 calls. Can you imagine? There were mountains of trash everywhere as the trash men went on strike. The grave diggers went on strike. So what do you do when the grave diggers go on strike? Well, you have piles of coffin and empty factories, and you get ready for mass burials at sea, which never actually happened, but they were preparing. There were food shortages. Hospital union leaders, not doctors, were deciding who should be admitted to hospital. Trolleys of food on their way to old folks' home were smashed. And British Rail put out the shortest press release in history: "There are no trains today." She became the fourth ever elected leader, following Mrs. Bandra of Sri Lanka, Mrs. Gandhi of India, and Golda Meir of Israel. But she was the first in the West, and she inherited an economy that was ranked 19th out of 22 in the OECD. And the French ambassador said we were suffering from dégringolade, which is French for falling down sickness. And Germany wasn't unified at that time, and the West German ambassador said we had the economy of East Germany. So it was a real insult there. So what did she do? In my book I summarise in 10 bullet points her major achievements. Let me just do them in the right order. She took on the whole of the union movement, which had been captured by extremists, brought it back under the rule of law and gave it back to its membership. She transformed the nation's views of the benefits of a market-based economy. She privatised the commanding heights of the economy and turned those behemoths that were guzzling up massive subsidies into sleek private sector firms that started paying taxes. She taught us the need for monetary continence if we want to enjoy low inflation. She enfranchised millions, literally millions of people who were living in local city-owned apartments, small houses. She gave them the right to buy their units of public housing, basically at half price. And 3 million did. She made Brits walk tall again with a firm, principled, robust, rule of law-based approach to international relations. She cut taxes from the 90s to the 80s to the 60s to the 40%, still high, but 40% is a lot better than 90%. And the fame drain stopped. That's the famous people moving overseas to escape the tax regime. And the brain drain stopped. In fact, the fame drain reversed itself, and famous people started relocating back to England. One of her favourites was Michael Caine, the movie actor, who relocated back from Hollywood. But he'd not gone to Hollywood for professional reasons, he'd gone for tax reasons. And she used to invite Michael to parties at number 10, up on the second floor there, and she would grab him by the arm when he came in, and take him around the room, introducing him to everybody, as if he needed any introduction. And instead she would say, "This is Michael, he came back." He was a great pagan. She started the process which led to peace in Northern Ireland. She helped Ronald Reagan and the Pope tear down that wall and thus destroy the evil empire. And she ensured that all future British governments had to have a much better appreciation of the benefit of a market-based society than had previously been the case. I mean, it got to the point that with Tony Blair, for example, when he became leader of the Labour Party, he had the Labour Party repeal Clause 4, the famous Clause 4 of its constitution. That was a clause that pledged it to public ownership of the economy. And Tony Blair realised that he was never going to get elected as long as Clause 4 was still hanging around his neck. So she had huge influence on the Labour Party as well. She was in power for 11 years, but really Thatcherism, John Major, really, there was no such thing as Majorism, there was just lukewarm Thatcherism. So I really count the whole 18-year period of Margaret and John as being one and the same. In those 18 years, we jumped from 19th to 2nd in the OECD list. Entrepreneurship doubled from 7% to 14%. When she came to power, we had no venture capital industry. 6 years later, our venture capital industry was twice the size of the entire continental venture capital industry. The group we call the middle class had jumped from 33% to 50% of the population. Home ownership, as opposed to renting or whatever, had jumped from 53% to 71%. Ownership of shares by individuals, that's where you choose the share that you want to own, the company you want to own shares in. Individual share ownership had jumped from 7% to 23%, and amongst trade union members to an astonishingly high 29%. And the percentage of the workforce belonging to a trade union had plummeted from 50%, 51% to just under 20%. And the number of days lost to strikes had plummeted from 30 million a year to 500,000 a year, and those 500,000 are in one industry. Anybody can guess which industry was the only remaining industry prone to strike?
Healthcare.
No, it was the post office. The story goes, and I have no idea if this is true, Margaret, of course, met the Queen, as all British Prime Ministers do, for an hour every week, and the Queen expressed some displeasure at the thought of the post office being privatised, because she feared that her face would no longer appear on every stamp. Of course, the market is making sure the post office disappears, with all the private sector alternatives that have sprung up in recent years. So what are my 10 lessons? I draw 10 lessons in my book, and then I'll wind up and you can ask me questions about Margaret, or even about the movie, The Iron Lady, which came out this past February. Above all, she had a very strong political, moral compass. I mean, she knew where she was going, she knew what was right, what was wrong. and there was no real uncertainty. I'll contradict myself in a few minutes, I'm sure, but she was very clear about where she wanted to go. Very early in her prime ministership, the Iranian embassy was taken over by terrorists, and 26 people were held, and the crack SAS regiment positioned itself on top of the embassy, ready to abseil down and crash in through the windows with slug grenades and so on. And the siege went on for about 5 days. On Sunday, Margaret was called at her country home, the Prime Minister's country home, Chequers, and was told that they'd thrown the body out. The hostages had shot somebody and thrown the body out on the street. And so she just said, go in. Right on the spot, she just said, go in. They went in, they took out all the terrorists and rescued all the hostages. That sent a very good signal. Secondly, she was able to cut through the gulf. She's a very clever person, but she speaks very plainly and very simply, a bit like Newt Gingrich, I tend to think. Neither Newt nor Margaret would ever say, at this moment in time. They would say, now. Good, short Anglo-Saxon words, right to the point. And she once said to my friend Simon Jenkins, the journalist, he was interviewing her, and he said, Prime Minister, let me ask you about your laissez-faire economic policy. And she looked Simon in the eye and she said, Simon, laissez-faire? Laissez-faire? Don't you go French on me. She did lead, and she expected a lot out of people around her. Two friends of mine had become MPs in the 80s, Michael in 83 and David in 87. And I've heard this story from both of them. On David's first day, he's walking through the members' lobby in the House of Commons. And Michael, who's a new minister by now, goes running through piles of paper under one arm and a bulging briefcase, and he's running. And David shouted out, slow down, Rome wasn't built in a day. And Michael shouted back over his shoulder as he disappeared down a corridor, yes, but Margaret wasn't the foreman on that job. Fourth, she championed policies that went with the grain of human nature, like the great privatizations and the public house sales, everything designed to incentivize. For example, when she privatized British Airways, she gave a large amount of stock was reserved for the staff and at a very low discount. Fifth, there was a lot of strategic thinking ahead of time. Ted Heath, for example, had been brought down by the coal miners because when the coal miners went on strike, there was only 2 to 3 weeks of coal reserves at the power station. So within 2 to 3 weeks, the government was basically done for. So Margaret had her energy secretary build up a year's worth of coal supplies. So when the miners eventually did take her on in '84, she had a year to fight them and bring them down. She had a lot of smart, dedicated people around her. When I first studied politics at the LSE in 1971, my politics tutor taught me that the Tory party was a stupid party. And there was a lot of truth to that, because a lot of people were there because of who their parents were, and not because of who they were. But that changed. It was changing prior to Thatcher, and Thatcher helped that along. Although she could be a little... She never promoted a man with a beard. She didn't trust men with beards. She never promoted a woman into the cabinet. In her 11.5 years, she had only 1 year when there was one woman. And that was the one position in cabinet that Margaret couldn't control. And that was when their lordships in the upper house elected a lady peer as their leader. And the leader of the House of Lords is automatically in the cabinet. And she survived a year. She also never promoted a young man called Jonathan Aitken, who was arguably the brightest of his generation. And as soon as she went, John Major promoted him hugely. And the reason for that lack of promotion was that sometime in the 70s, Margaret Thatcher had gone home to her house in Chelsea in Flood Street and found Carol, her daughter, crying, and Jonathan Aitken had dumped her. Jonathan never got a whiff of a job. 8, we must not forget Ronald Reagan and their incredible partnership. They just did not believe in the Soviet statistics, the statistics about our economy. I found the following quote from Margaret Thatcher. This is 1950. right, when she's running for the first time, 1950. We believe in the democratic way of life. If we serve the idea faithfully, with tenacity of purpose, we have nothing to fear from Russian communism. 1950. So if we stick to principle, you know, we've got nothing to fear. But in the 60s, I was being trained as a schoolboy to hide under my desk when the Russian nukes came. But as early as 1950, Margaret said, nothing to fear. She prepared, she had 4 years, she became leader of the party in 75, became Prime Minister in 79, and she put those 4 years to good use. And lastly, she didn't try to do it all at once. She didn't try and privatise 50 companies in her first year. She did a few a year. The same with the labour law. She didn't try and do it in one ginormous bill that would have brought every single trade unionist out on the street. She chopped away. Every couple of years there was a big labour bill to carve into those legal immunities. So how do we rate her? Well, the BBC, which many people say is institutionally left-leaning, has rated her the 16th greatest Briton ever. Ever. Thousands of years of history. 16th. Charles Moore, who's one of our most distinguished editors and journalists, recently wrote that with all due respect to Her Majesty the Queen, Margaret Thatcher is the greatest living Englishwoman. And finally, Francis Beckett, who is one of our most prominent historians, recently wrote a book ranking the 20 Prime Ministers of the 20th century. Very neat, we have 20 Prime Ministers in the 20th century. I'm sure you can all guess who comes bottom. Neville Chamberlain, of course. And I won't bore you with reading, well, I'll mention one or two surprising ones. John Major, 18th. Maybe that's not so surprising. Tony Blair, 12th. And then you get to the top 5. 5th, Harold Macmillan. 4th, Winston Churchill. 3rd, Edward Heath. 2nd, Clement Attlee. And 1st, Margaret Thatcher. So there you have not only the longest serving Prime Minister, but arguably the one that achieved the most. I'll be very happy to take questions either about my book or about my new book that the Chairman mentioned, Ladies for Liberty, about my 20 favourite women in American history. You might think it odd that I'm now writing a British economist, who's a male, writing women's history books. But what happened was after I wrote the Thatcher book, I was on the road a lot speaking about her, and I would come back to our place in Florida and basically complaining about my audiences, saying how as soon as we got to the Q&A on Thatcher, somebody would inevitably say, why didn't we have a Margaret Thatcher? To which I would reply, well, crikey, you know, American history is stuffed with great women. There's more great women in American history than the history of any other nation. And I'd rattle off a few names, and after the obvious ones like Martha and Abigail, I found recognition was going into the cellar. Now you all know how respectful teenagers can be to their parents. My then 19-year-old said to me one night in a Chinese restaurant in Port Charlotte, Florida, I think it was. He said, for heaven's sake, Dad, shut up, you're being very boring. He said, just write a book about them all. So that's this book, which is a flyer out on the table, Ladies for Liberty, about my 20 favourite women in American history. But I'm pleased to take questions for about the next 15 minutes. Gentleman at the back.
Could you say something about the election when conservatives took power? How close was it? What kind of arguments did Labour make to try to stay in power? And did those arguments bear any resemblance to what we're hearing today in the United States?
Well, the 79 election, when she came to power, was, as I started my remarks, was after the Winter of Discontent. And the longer that went on, the more she toughened up her party's platform, the more she thought there was a British appetite, if you like. I mean, there was really a feeling back in the Winter of Discontent that we were in the last chance saloon. That if we didn't do something now, we were going to go the way of, say, in Argentina. You know, a formerly prosperous country that becomes a basket case. And there was even a headline in the Daily Telegraph in '78, cheer up, things are getting worse. Meaning that the appetite for real radical change doesn't exist when you can muddle through. It's only when you're not muddling through that people say, wait a minute, we've really got to do something about this. So she was lucky in that respect. There were so many parts to your question. I think
Oh, I'm sorry about that. The second part was, what kind of arguments did Labour make to try to hold on to power?
Back then, the sort of arguments that you're hearing more and more in the United States today. Margaret discovered sort of blue-collar Democrats, if you like, ahead of Reagan, because Reagan wasn't to come into power for about nearly 2 years. Margaret was there the last year or so of Jimmy Carter, all of Reagan, and the first year or so of Bush 1. Jimmy Carter, by the way, didn't like her very much. He found he couldn't get a word in edgeways when they met. And Bush, which wasn't too sure about Bush, when the first Kuwait war came along, what was it she said to Bush? Don't go wobbly, George, don't go wobbly on me. But she loved Ronald Reagan, of course. No, it was just the same old Keynesian centrist, left of centre. But she was out there. She went out every day in a big bus from London, and she sensed. And the police were normally in Britain pretty good at judging numbers. The crowds that turned out to see her were twice, thrice what the police expected. And the roads, somehow her travel plans would leak, and the roads would be lined with people, wearing, waving banners, and bunches of flowers were, I don't know, all that sort of thing was going on. And she won reasonably comfortably, about 45 majority. But then, of course, in the next two elections, won huge majorities, three-figure majorities. Made the Tories a little complacent, in fact. They got such big majorities, and then Major, of course, won. And that complacency was shattered when Tony Blair came to power with an even bigger majority. Gentleman here.
Yeah, how would you compare Reagan and Thatcher? Who do you think's the best leader?
The better.
Better leader.
It's very hard to compare them. I mean, they were both great individuals. They knew each other from way back. It was Dennis Thatcher who first spotted Ronald Reagan, sorry, and came running home at night and said, Margaret, this wonderful American politician you've got to meet. Because he was a member of a group called the Institute of Directors. And the Institute had just had its annual dinner, and I guess former Governor Reagan had been their speaker. And it was then arranged for them to have 90 minutes together twice when Reagan was passing through London, and both times the meeting ran over 3 hours. And when he became president, she was not the first leader to be invited to the White House, but she was the first of any significance. She was the second person to come to the White House, but the person who beat her was the president or prime minister of some obscure Pacific island or something, not a major Western leader. And of course, from there on, they spent more time together than their relationship makes the so-called other special relationships look pretty insignificant. Gentleman here with glasses.
How do you feel that the movies portrayed her? I know the BBC did one movie on her, and then we had one as well. Did you see either one of those, and what were your thoughts?
I've surprisingly not seen the BBC one, and I think one of the independent channels is also making one, because I was phoned by them recently. The Meryl Streep movie, I think you've got to differentiate between a movie and a documentary, and you shouldn't criticise movies for not being accurate, because they're movies. In documentaries you can criticise for not being accurate, but not movies. And they took liberties. They moved the Winter of Discontent, made it 5 years earlier. There's a scene in the Meryl Streep movie of Margaret in 1974, and there's all these piles of trash around her, talking to a colleague. And that's 79, but they were looking for a dramatic way to make a sense of crisis come across. And they get a few other things wrong. I'm not one of those. A lot of people said it shouldn't have been made, because a large part of the movie is Margaret, aged 86, suffering from dementia. And And to begin with, I kind of leant that way, and I thought, well, no, you know, when you enter public life, you can't enter public life and then sort of exit in a way. The law changes about what can be said about you. And she had such a long time in public life that I thought I changed my mind. Also, I think the way the dementia is portrayed is quite sensitive. It's not as if she's shown as being completely out of it all day, every day. There's some very lucid. If anything, I think the balance of the movie is wrong. There's too much of her aged 86 and not enough of her aged, you know, whatever, 40 to 67. Street did a brilliant job. I think one of the funniest moments is when Margaret is dragged off 4 months early for her annual checkup. Her daughter Carol, who's brilliantly portrayed. The only person that's not well done in the movie is Dennis Thatcher. Everybody else in the movie that I know personally, I think is very well portrayed. With the cabinet, the Conservative cabinet, you could tell who you didn't need them. You could tell instantly who they were. It was almost like they cloned them. Having said that she's suffering from dementia, I did say that she has these lucid moments. There's a brilliant moment where Carol takes her to the doctor 3 or 4 months early, and she's had the physical checkup, and she's now having the mental health sort of checkup, and the doctor's asking her questions, and she's clearly lying. And she clearly knows exactly what he's after, and she's lying. And the phone starts to ring on the doctor's table. It rings once, he ignores it. It rings a second time, and he ignores it, and Margaret's sort of glaring at the phone and glaring at him. It rings a third time, and she butts in and she says something like, don't you think you should answer that phone? After all, it might be somebody who actually needs your help. It's better delivered than that. But if there's an Oscar, if they could give an Oscar for the best single line in a movie, that line would get it. The gentleman at the back left.
Yes, I noticed you mentioned that Margaret Thatcher didn't do a lot of promoting of women into her in offices. But did she, after leaving office, did she invest any time or spend any time creating any conduits for other women into politics or into that arena?
I don't think so. She didn't really think that way. I mean, she was just interested in merit and people bringing her solutions. She promoted women up to the Minister of State level, which is just one step outside the cabinet. I asked her once, Lady T, because when she was in her last 20 years since she's been in the House of Lords, that's another thing they get wrong in the movie. They have her staff calling her Lady Thatcher, and they have her staff calling her Margaret, depending on how close they are. In fact, all of her staff call her Lady T. We all call her Lady T. I said to Lady T, I said that we're most proud of being the first woman Prime Minister, or the first scientist to become Prime Minister. And she said, oh, scientist, without thinking. I mean, she just doesn't think in those sorts of terms. A friend of mine wrote a great book called about the history of the welfare state. I forget his name's, I'm blanking on the name of the book. And at the same meeting that I asked Margaret about that question I just relayed to you, I said, he went up to her and he said, he called her Prime Minister. Prime Minister, he said, I've dedicated a copy of my book here to you, a great big fat hardback book, and he'd written a lavish inscription in the front, and was giving it to her, and she could see it was inscribed to her, and so on and so forth. She said, what's this about? And he said, well, it's about the terrible welfare state we've got into, and the unintended consequences of the welfare state, and so on and so forth. And she said, well, young man, he was about 55, well, young man, what's the solution? Oh, he said that's for somebody else to write. I just concentrated on how we came up with the problem. And she started hitting him. Here, with the book, two-handed. Young man, don't you bring me problems, bring me solutions. That was about 3 years, 4 years. Gentleman here.
What do you see as the future of the Tory party? They had obviously a good opportunity with a really bad economy in 2010 and still couldn't win an outright majority, had to do a coalition. 79, obviously, like you were describing, was a confluence of events to power. There's also still views of Thatcherism by some in the middle left or as being harsh and confrontational, all those things. Where does the future lie for that kind of thinking in Britain?
Well, I think there's a number of things. Firstly, I think it's quite fair to say that we're all Thatcher's children now. Even Tony Blair and Gordon Brown are Thatcher's children in a sense, and large parts of the Liberal Party as well. The maths, of course, have changed because the Liberal Party has grown. I mean, when the Liberal Party used to be about 6 members of the MPs, they were irrelevant. Now they're about 60. And of course, David Cameron hasn't been allowed to form a government. He's formed a coalition with the Lib Dems, which is destroying their base. Their base doesn't like being part of the coalition. For the Tories, one of two things, or at least one of the following two things needs to happen. Either Scotland goes independent, and of course the Scot Nats want independence. They've been promised a referendum. If it was hardly, is there one Tory MP now in Scotland? Maybe it was 0 at one point. That means about 60 Labour, left-leaning Labour MPs and Scottish National MPs would no longer be sitting in the House of Commons, and would pretty much hand the Tories a permanent majority. That's one thing. The other thing that would need to happen would be for the Lib Dems to collapse back to being only half a dozen or a dozen. Because they tend to take seats from the Tories. They don't take seats from Labour. They take seats from the Tories. So both those things are in the wind. You've got Scottish independence in the wind, and you've got the collapse of the Lib Dem Party in the wind. And you've got all these generations now who don't recall the world before Margaret Thatcher. Gentleman here.
Could you share a story that might not be publicly known that you as an advisor saw personally, up close and personal, that could give a glimpse into Margaret Thatcher, that would communicate maybe who she was or something very significant for us? Just a personal story.
There's quite a few in the book. I was in at the start of the thinking on the right to buy public housing. I was elected aged 26 as a London councilman, and I realised within months that the economics of public housing was just crazy. And I said to Margaret over dinner one night at the Café Royal, I said, we should have legislation ready so that when you become Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, we will instruct the directors of legal services at all the counties, the county councils and the city councils, to hand over the deeds, literally to mail the deeds to the sitting tenants, to get all 6 million units off our hands. I trotted out the figures, showed her the figures. And an instant response was no. He said, no, John. He said, people will not value them unless they paid at least something for them. Out of that conversation came the right to buy scheme, which basically said that all sitting tenants who'd been there had been up to date on their rent for at least 3 years, had a statutory right to buy, and that for and they immediately got a third of a fair market price, as agreed by 3 independent realtors, and that for every extra year they paid rent, they got another 1%, up to a maximum of 17 more years. So if you've been in your unit for 20 years, you've got 33 for your first 3 years, and 17 for the next 17 years, then you've got half price. Now you couldn't resell for, I think if you resold within 3 years, the government got the profit. You had to then stay in that place for at least 3 more years. And the result is hundreds of thousands of Brits now living in Spain and Portugal in happy retirement as a result of buying those apartments back then. And it's about 3 million of the 6 million moved. But there are several more stories. There's the story of the day we gave her 50 red roses on her 50th birthday. This is a good one, actually. I was National Vice Chairman of the Federation of Conservative Students, and my chairman was Michael Forsyth, who later became Secretary of State for Scotland. And we knew Margaret's 50th was approaching, so we hit on the idea of turning up at her Flood Street house with a bunch of students in the background, and Michael giving her 50 red roses. And so I organised the roses, I recruited the students, and we informed the press, and we got there to Flood Street about 7 o'clock in the morning on her birthday, and I looked out of the taxi. I said, Michael, I said, I can't see any students, and there would be an important backdrop, which shows some good-looking young people to make a nice backdrop. And I said, wait here, and there was a policeman, of course, on duty. I went up to the policeman. Before I could say anything, he said, you're looking for your students, aren't you, sir? And I said, yes, I am, actually. I need them for a backdrop, for a photo scene. And he said, Mrs. Thatcher saw them out here about half an hour ago, and she invited them in for a cup of tea. Shall I go and get them? I said, yes, please. So he should go down the path, knocked on the door, out came the students, formed the backdrop. Then Margaret comes out with an apron on. Michael gives her the 50, there weren't actually 50 red roses, we lost about 3, and heads had snapped off. So she only actually got 47. I had them in my pocket, because it was a huge thing in the back of a London cab. And those photos went all over the world. And there's a few more stories like that. How are we doing on time? I'm making 20 after. One more, sorry. The lady here.
I was wondering about the healthcare system when she took over, and then how that progressed to the current system that they have, and maybe with some of the discussion we're having today here in the States.
If Margaret was here today, she would be more worried about Obamacare than about the deficits. Because once you get socialised medicine, it becomes like a religion. In fact, I forget who it was, Nigel Lawson or Geoffrey Howe, something like that, once said that the National Health Service has replaced the Church of England in the English psyche. Should be more worried. What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Just basically that, how it changed from when she was there.
Well, it didn't change much. In fact, when she got going on privatisations and the '87 election was forthcoming, Labour started beating the drum that she was going to privatise the National Health Service. And she was privatising everything else, for God's sake. She's going to privatise, and that was a big scaremongering that was going on. And it was very effective. It drove her to say, the National Health Service is safe in our hands. So she didn't change it that much. And even the great Margaret Thatcher found that once you get socialised medicine, like I said, it becomes a state religion.
That's our time. We want one more? All right, one more.
This is maybe a little irrelevant, but I'm reflecting on your statement that, about the ranking of the 20th century prime ministers, and I'm not surprised to see that Ms. Thatcher was #1, but how is it that Clement Attlee and Edward Heath were ahead of Churchill?
Good question. Heath, of course, achieved what no other British prime minister had, every other British prime minister failed to do, and that was to take us into the common market. And that was seen as a great achievement. It's a disaster. But politically, at the time, it was seen as a huge step forward. It was sold as a free market, just an economic thing, free market. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, everybody except a small handful of Tory MPs supported it. It was seen, and Labour opposed it. And of course, it swung 180 degrees. Now, it's the Labour Party that's the Tories who are more and more worried about it, and Labour who are less and less worried. They see them getting a lot of their policy goals through the EU. Does that?
What about Attlee?
Oh, Attlee. Well, I mean, he nationalised the British economy. I mean, he was the one that nationalised all the companies, and Margaret was later to denationalise. Which at the time, I mean, if they had won in 50 or 51, they would have got even more. I mean, cement, the list of things they had in their 51 election. Insurance was going to be nationalised, the banks, cement, sugar, everything. When I first studied British politics in '78, the Labour Party, my local Labour Party in South London, favoured nationalising funeral directors. Because if profits are immoral, which clearly they are, then profits from death must be doubly immoral. So that all has changed. Thank you very much.